Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Hutzelman, there has been much debate in this state about how to provide for the long-term water needs of Texas. And you have said that government is really no solution to it, and you've called for increased private ownership of water resources. Now, if that doesn't mean that everyone in Texas should go out and dig his own well, what does it mean?
Well, it simply means that government, I think, is a very inefficient conserver of any natural resource. I think we found that out in the energy crisis. The government regulations were actually standing in the way of supplying increased energy. I think water is a commodity just like crude oil is. The fact that it needs to be provided, and it's an important part of our life, is all the more reason that we need to get some privatization, some private conservation into the water situation. If you attempt to subsidize water usage at lower than what the cost is, you simply encourage wasteful consumption. A private conservator, a private manager of water resources is a person who makes sure that when he sells water, that it is replacement cost is covered so that he can continue an adequate supply to supply people in the future. So in that context, I think we need to increase our investigation of defining how water can be owned the same way crude oil or any other commodity that we need needs to be owned so that it can be effectively conserved, distributed to the consumers.
Do you have a follow-up?
I'm still confused about how you would bring about this private ownership. You know, in other words, we'd have just a lot of private companies. We have private utility companies that have gotten in trouble.
We have water districts now. I don't
districts or things of this what you're talking about?
Right. I'm talking about the fact that there is no reason, inherent reason, that the government has to be the owner of any commodity. The government doesn't own all the food in this country, and somehow or other it all finds its way to our tables every day so that we can eat. Neither do they need to be the ultimate owner of all the other resources. And I think that when we return the decision-making about these resources to private individuals, and I'm not talking about just turning it over to them. Obviously, we have to figure out a transition program to define those rights and to transfer those rights if that's the direction we choose to go in. But that in the long run, we will make sure that there's adequate supplies for everyone by that type of a procedure.
Ms. Garrison.
Mr. Hutzelman, I'm kind of curious as to exactly what you would do if you reduce or return taxes to the people as you suggested. What would you do for the building and maintenance of highways? How would you pay for law enforcement? What would you do with the institutionalization of society's outcasts, handicapped people?
Well, Barbara, right now the proposal that I've made is to return the surplus taxes to the people and to reduce the sales tax in the future. There is no reason for the state to hoard surplus tax money which has been taken from individuals because it needs to be returned to the economy where it can be used to create jobs. The tax reductions that I'm talking about can be made by sunsetting such regulatory agencies as a Railroad Commission, which I made a case for in my 1980 campaign. There are other agencies which I think we can cut their tax money because they're not in the best interest of consumers and they're not doing the job as it was they were chartered to do, and they can never do the job because they interfere with competition and protect the producers in order to ensure that the rates which producers get are artificially high.
But isn't your ultimate aim to virtually do away with taxes by the state, by the federal government? Isn't that the Libertarian?
Our ultimate aim, yes, is to work towards a situation where private individuals can work together voluntarily in cooperation in the same way we've talked about food production and other things, that services can be, in fact, generated by and large in the private sector. There are going to be some things that government is going to have to do. We recognize that. There's a national defense, police system, and a court system. The ways of funding these can be varied. They can either be from a contributory subscription basis. They can be from perhaps a surcharge on enforcing contracts by the legal system. I think that the money can be raised to provide those essential services which libertarians believe the government should have, namely to protect individuals' rights.
You're not saying volunteerism to build highways, are you?
No, not volunteerism to build highways. I don't think that the privatization of highways is the prime issue that we need to talk about in the governor's campaign. I think there are some things we can do as it relates to highway expenditures and regulations like the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, which causes more people to be on the highways than are necessary, and trucking regulations, which cause trucks to run empty because they can't carry certain commodities that they haven't been licensed, and they're on the highways a lot longer than they need to be.
Okay, let's let Mr. Hutzelman pause for a second and breathe before your follow-up question. Go ahead, Barbara.
The 1983 legislature, Mr. Hutzelman, will grapple with increasing the gasoline tax in order to pay for an expanding highway budget. Now, that's something that the governor is going to have to deal with.
I would definitely oppose an increase in the gasoline tax. I think the problem primarily that people see in the highway deterioration is in major metropolitan areas where more taxes are collected than they are spent for highways. I think in terms of building new roads, that we certainly can investigate options like toll roads and other facilities which are built where users pay the cost, and people that don't have cars or don't live in that area aren't forced to subsidize commuters or other use of the roads.
So, Hutzelman, you used the word licensing a while ago, and that triggered something. I remember you're saying that you were against occupational licensing, for example, of daycare centers and barbers and beauticians and taxi cab drivers. Right. Well, my question is, if you don't have this state licensing thing, what happens to standards? How can you feel safe about leaving your child at a daycare center, or how can you feel safe about some guy approaching your face with a straight razor?
Well, obviously, we are not opposed to private organizations creating their own standards for certification, which I assume that their members would prominently display and which consumers would look for. I think an example of the market solution to this is an underwriter's laboratory sticker, which most people look for on their appliances to make sure that it's a safe appliance. The problem with occupational licensing laws is they are used by the people in that profession to exclude other people, sometimes unemployed and unskilled people. Jobs such as taxi drivers, where all you would need is a car to go into the business, there are major hurdles in terms of licensing and other legal fees that represent a barrier toward people earning a living and supporting themselves. People that could be gainfully employed, consumers could be getting the benefit of increased competition and lower prices. And that is why, in general, we oppose occupational licensing laws as being in addition to state law, not to private certification.
The history of self-regulation by certain professions and industries in this country, it's not a very good record. Would you like to stand on? That's why we have government regulation, because there hasn't been good self-regulation.
The problem is that the alternative is not a very good alternative either. The alternative is higher costs of everything, higher costs of medical care, higher costs of every service, because arbitrary standards are set by one person or a group of people and imposed on everyone else. No set of laws is going to make everyone perfect, or are they going to guarantee that no one will make mistakes or ever try to market a product that will not work in the way it's advertised. We support strong liability laws and damages against any person offering services which represent fraud or which cause damages. We do not think, however, that it is the proper function of the government to try to set what standards that you and I may feel as a consumer we want to use in our services. Daycare centers could certainly and easily be inspected by PTAs and endorsed or certified by PTAs. There's all sorts of ways people can mutually work together to make sure that people's reputations are upheld. In the neighborhood, for instance, in poor neighborhoods, when you want to take care of your neighbor's children or a group of children, or if you want to cut their hair or supply barbering services or something, we don't think there's any reason for you to have to go to the government and get a license to do that when it's someone you know and can be used as a neighborhood service.
Do you have a follow-up?
I have a question.
Excuse me, yes.
You talk about doing away with victimless crimes and legalizing drugs. Can you talk about that a little? Just explain what you mean.
Yes, Barbara, I think
Let me interrupt you just a second and ask you to please watch your time cues. We don't have full 2 minutes for your answer. So if you can watch the clock and the light.
I think that the regulation of drugs is a serious ethical consideration as well as some practical implications. I do not think it's right that terminally ill people can be deprived of the opportunity to use unproven or different drugs if it's determined that they think that it's in the best interest between them and their physicians. On the other hand, drug regulation has forced black market drugs of unknown quantity onto the marketplace where they are consumed by people that have no idea of what's in them, and with many cases with very disastrous results. Thirdly, drug regulation has contributed to victims that don't even have anything to do with drugs. The high black market price of drugs, if they cannot be treated by the medical community, and if you make a person a criminal when they do become an addict, they simply go out and rob and steal other innocent people to support these products.